November 1923, Weimar, Germany. You're standing in line at a bakery in Berlin. Behind the counter, scrawled in chalk on a wooden board, the price reads 200 billion marks for one loaf of bread. Not 200 marks, not 200 million, 200 billion. You've been waiting in line for 12 minutes. Finally, you reach the front. The baker doesn't smile, he doesn't apologize, he simply picks up the chalk, crosses out the number, and writes a new one, 250 billion marks. In 12 minutes, you just lost 30% of your purchasing power. Not because you made a bad investment, not because you gambled. You lost it standing still. The woman ahead of you isn't carrying a purse. She's pushing a wheelbarrow. It's overflowing with cash, stacks of banknotes bound together with string, just to buy a bottle of milk for her children. This sounds like dystopian fiction. It sounds like a scene from a post-apocalyptic movie. But this isn't fiction. This is historical fact. This happened in one of the most advanced, industrialized nations on Earth. And here's what should terrify you. It didn't just happen once. It happened in Germany. It happened in Zimbabwe in 2008. It happened in Venezuela in 2018. It happened in Lebanon just 3 years ago. And right now, as I'm recording this, the early warning signs are flashing in at least 3 more countries. The uncomfortable truth. Here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. The thing most financial advisors will never tell you. Currencies are like milk. They have an expiration date. According to a study published by Deutsche Bank, analyzing 775 different currencies throughout recorded history, the average lifespan of a fiat currency, paper money not backed by gold, silver, or any physical commodity, is just 27 years. 27 years. The current US dollar system, the one we're living under right now, started in August of 1971. That's when President Richard Nixon closed the gold window, severing the last link between the dollar and physical gold. That was 54 years ago. We are living on borrowed time. But here's what makes this different from every other financial video you've watched. I'm not here to scare you into buying something. I'm here to show you what actually happened, documented, verified, in 5 different economic collapses across the last century. I didn't look for theories. I didn't interview gurus. I looked at the autopsy reports. I found the survivors, the people who didn't just make it through but came out the other side with their wealth intact. By the end of this video, you will know the exact 5-asset blueprint that has survived total monetary collapse in every documented case in modern history. But before I give you the list, you need to understand the trap, because currency collapse isn't random. It's not bad luck. It follows a pattern as predictable as gravity, and once you see the pattern, you'll recognize it happening right now. Section 1. The 5 stages of currency death. Every currency collapse in recorded history follows the same 5 stages. It doesn't matter if it's Germany in the 1920s, or Argentina in the 2000s, or Lebanon today. The sequence never changes. Stage 1. The spending problem. The government spends more money than it collects in taxes. This creates a deficit. At first, it's manageable. They borrow money by issuing bonds. Investors believe the government is good for it. Everyone stays calm. But here's the trap. Once they start, they can't stop. Political incentives make it impossible. Every politician promises more services, more benefits, more programs. Nobody wants to be the one who cuts spending and loses the next election. In the Weimar Republic, the spending crisis started in 1914 with World War I. Germany financed the war almost entirely through debt, expecting to win and force the losers to pay. They lost. By 1918, Germany owed 150 billion marks. The Treaty of Versailles demanded reparations on top of that, 132 billion gold marks, payable over decades. The debt was mathematically unpayable. But instead of defaulting, the government made a fatal choice. They moved to Stage 2. Stage 2, the printing press. When a government runs out of money and can't borrow anymore, it has 2 choices, default or print. Defaulting means admitting failure. It means global humiliation, so they print. In January 1919, there were 29 billion marks in circulation in Germany. By November 1923, there were 497 quintillion marks in circulation. That's a 497 followed by 18 zeros. Most people don't know this, but the Reichsbank actually ran out of printing capacity. They couldn't physically print money fast enough, so they hired private printing companies. At the peak, 133 printing presses were running 24 hours a day just to keep up with demand. The government convinced itself this was temporary, just until things stabilized, just until the economy recovered. It never does. Stage 3. The slow leak. At first, the new money seems fine. Prices go up a little. People notice, but they adjust. Wages increase. Businesses raise prices. Life continues. But this is the most dangerous stage because people still believe the money works. They haven't lost faith yet. In Germany, between 1919 and 1921, inflation was bad, but not catastrophic. Prices rose tenfold. People grumbled, but they adapted. Workers demanded higher wages. Businesses printed new price lists every month instead of every year. The government told them this was normal post-war adjustment. They said the economy was healing, but behind the scenes, the math was screaming. Here's the key. Inflation isn't just rising prices. It's the loss of purchasing power, and purchasing power dies exponentially, not linearly. Stage 4. The panic. This is the moment when perception shifts. People suddenly realize the money is bad. It's not a slow realization, it's a stampede. In Germany, the stampede began in mid-1922. Workers demanded to be paid twice a day, at lunch and at the end of the shift, because money lost value between morning and evening. Wives would meet their husbands at the factory gates at lunchtime to immediately spend the wages before they depreciated. Shops stopped posting prices entirely. They would quote you a price when you walked in, and if you took too long deciding, they'd raise it before you reached the counter. This is when people dump the currency for anything else: gold, foreign money, real estate, even furniture and pianos, because a piano holds its value better than paper money. At this stage, the wealthy and the informed have already escaped. They converted to hard assets months ago. The people getting destroyed are the middle class, the savers, the ones who trusted the system. Stage 5. Total collapse. The currency goes to zero, not metaphorically, literally. By November 1923, $1 was worth 4.2 trillion marks. The government printed a 100 trillion mark note. It wasn't enough to buy a loaf of bread. People wallpapered their homes with worthless banknotes because it was cheaper than buying wallpaper. Children built block towers with stacks of billion-mark notes because the paper had more value as a toy than as money. The Weimar hyperinflation officially ended on November 15, 1923, when Germany introduced a new currency, the Rentenmark. Overnight, one Rentenmark replaced 1 trillion old marks. The old money became museum pieces. Every person who held savings in the old currency lost everything. Bank accounts, pensions, bonds, all vaporized. But here's the thing that history makes clear, and this is critical. During every single stage of this collapse, there were 5 specific categories of assets that did not go to zero. In fact, they either held their value or became more valuable. These are the survivors. And we're going to go through them one by one, with real data from real collapses. Let me start with the most obvious one, and yet most people still don't own it: precious metals. Gold and silver are the only assets on Earth that cannot be printed, counterfeited, or created by government decree. They are finite, scarce, tangible. Think of gold as an anchor. When the storm hits and your paper currency sinks, the anchor doesn't move. It stays at the bottom, unaffected by the chaos on the surface. During the Weimar collapse, here's what happened. If you held paper marks, you were annihilated. You lost 100% of your wealth. Your life savings became trash. But if you held gold, you lost nothing. In 1918, an ounce of gold bought you a quality men's suit in Berlin. In 1923, at the height of hyperinflation, an ounce of gold still bought you a quality men's suit. And in 1924, after the currency reset, an ounce of gold still bought the same suit. The currency changed, the price tags changed, gold stayed the same. Here's a detail most people don't know. In 1923, Germans who owned gold couldn't always sell it legally within Germany because of currency controls. So a black market emerged. Gold dealers operated in secret. People smuggled gold coins across borders into Switzerland and France, where they could exchange them for stable foreign currency and smuggle that cash back. Gold became an underground economy. It saved entire families. Fast forward to Zimbabwe, 2008. The Zimbabwean dollar collapsed so completely that the government eventually printed a $100 trillion note. It was worth about 30 US cents. But here's what happened to gold. In 2007, before the final collapse, gold was trading at around $600 US per ounce. By 2011, it hit $1,900 per ounce. It rose 216% while the local currency evaporated. We're seeing this right now in Turkey. Inflation is running wild. The Turkish lira has lost 80% of its value against the dollar since 2018. So what are Turkish citizens doing? They're buying gold at record rates. In 2022 and 2023, Turkey became one of the top gold-buying nations in the world, not the government, the people. They know the pattern. Now, critics hate gold. They'll tell you it doesn't pay dividends, it doesn't generate cash flow, it just sits there. They call it a pet rock, a barbarous relic. They're missing the entire point. Gold isn't an investment designed to make you rich. Gold is insurance designed to keep you from becoming poor. It works because of one fundamental principle: scarcity. A government can type $1 trillion into existence on a computer screen in less than 5 seconds. Jerome Powell, chairman of the Federal Reserve, can authorize a money creation with a single phone call. They cannot type gold into existence. When the supply of paper money explodes, the value of that money drops. Since the supply of gold remains stable, its purchasing power relative to paper increases. Look at the 2008 financial crisis. In September and October 2008, gold initially dropped from $1,000 to $700 per ounce because panicked investors were selling everything to raise cash. But once the dust settled and the Federal Reserve began printing trillions in quantitative easing, gold shot up 166% over the next 3 years, reaching an all-time high in 2011. Silver did even better. It went from under $9 per ounce in 2008 to over $48 in 2011. That's a 430% return. Gold and silver are the ultimate insurance policy against government monetary incompetence. Sometimes the best way to save your house is to sleep in your neighbor's house. When your local currency is dying, the escape hatch is holding someone else's stable currency. Let me give you a real example. And this one is gut-wrenching because it's recent and it's documented. Beirut, Lebanon. October 2019. Imagine you're a nurse. You've worked hard for 10 years at a hospital in Beirut. You've been careful. You've saved the equivalent of $50,000 in a Lebanese bank account, denominated in Lebanese pounds. The official exchange rate has been stable at 1,500 pounds to the dollar for 22 years. It's been pegged since 1997. You trust the system. You feel safe. Then in October 2019, the peg breaks. The banks freeze withdrawals. The government lies. The system cracks. In 2019, the exchange rate was 1,500 pounds to the dollar. By 2020, it fell to 6,000. By 2021, it crashed to 20,000. By 2023, the black market rate hit 89,000 pounds per dollar. Your $50,000 sitting in that bank account, locked behind capital controls, is now worth around $840. You lost 98% of your life's work. You are destitute. But here's the tragedy. Your coworker, another nurse doing the exact same job, made one different choice. She didn't trust the banks. She kept her savings in physical US dollar bills, stored outside the banking system, hidden in her home. She maintained 100% of her purchasing power. Not because she was smarter, not because she had insider information. She just didn't trust the government's promises. Was the US dollar magic? No. She could have held Swiss francs. She could have held euros. She could have held British pounds. The specific paper didn't matter. What mattered was that she held a life raft while the ship sank. This pattern is universal. It's happened over and over again. Zimbabwe. By 2008, the Zimbabwean dollar was so worthless that ordinary people simply refused to accept it. The economy dollarized itself, not through government decree, but through survival instinct. Street vendors, taxi drivers, grocery stores, everyone started demanding US dollars. The government eventually gave up and officially adopted the US dollar in 2009. Argentina. Right now, if you want to buy a house in Buenos Aires, you don't use pesos. Real estate transactions are conducted in US dollars, cash, paid under the table. The official exchange rate is meaningless. Everyone uses the black market blue dollar rate. Cambodia. When you withdraw money from an ATM in Phnom Penh, the machine dispenses US dollars, not Cambodian reals. The entire economy runs on dollars because people trust it more than their own currency. This isn't government policy. This is human survival instinct. When the house is on fire, you run for the exit. Foreign hard currency is the exit. This is the one that separates amateurs from professionals. It sounds completely wrong. It defies common sense. But the data is undeniable. In 2017, the Venezuelan stock market, the Caracas Stock Exchange, rose 3,400%. In January 2018 alone, it tripled in value in just 9 trading days. You're probably thinking, wait, Venezuela was collapsing. The country was in chaos. People were starving. Why were stock prices exploding? Here's the secret, and this is critical to understand. A stock isn't a lottery ticket. A stock is a legal claim on real assets. A factory, a warehouse full of steel, a fleet of trucks, a mine full of copper, a plantation of coffee trees. When the currency becomes worthless, the price tag on those real assets changes. The factory is still a factory. It still produces goods. It just takes more worthless currency to buy a share of that factory. The company didn't become more valuable. The money became weaker. But listen closely, because this is where most people lose everything. Not all stocks are safe. In fact, most stocks are death traps during hyperinflation. If you own a local bakery that sells bread to local customers for local currency, you're bankrupt. Your costs skyrocket because you have to buy flour, sugar, and electricity at inflating prices. But your customers are paying you in worthless money. Your real profit margin goes to zero. You're working harder every day to earn less and less. But what if you own a copper mine? You're digging up copper in Venezuela. You're paying your workers in cheap, inflating local currency. But you're selling that copper to China for US dollars or euros. Your costs go down in real terms. Your revenue stays strong in hard currency. You're actually getting richer. This exact pattern played out in Mexico in 1994 during the tequila crisis. The peso collapsed 50% overnight. Mexican companies that sold domestically were slaughtered. But Mexican export companies, especially manufacturers selling to the United States, saw their stock prices soar because their dollar-based revenues went up while their peso-based costs went down. The same thing happened in Asia during the 1997-98 financial crisis. The Thai baht, Indonesian rupiah, and Malaysian ringgit all collapsed. Local businesses went bankrupt, but export-focused companies thrived. Here's the formula. You need companies that have revenue in hard currency and costs in soft currency. That's the survival filter. Examples: mining companies, agricultural exporters, manufacturers with international clients, oil and gas companies that sell on global markets. Avoid banks, domestic retailers, real estate companies, utilities, and anything that depends on a functioning local economy. So now we have three survivors: gold, foreign currency, and export stocks. These protect your wealth on paper, but they all have one fatal flaw. You can't eat a stock certificate, you can't shave a gold bar to buy a haircut, you can't walk into a grocery store during a blackout and pay with a Swiss franc. When the banks close their doors forever and the power grid fails, you need something else. You need a way to survive day to day, to trade for food, medicine, and safety. There's one specific asset class that became the de facto currency across Europe after World War II. It wasn't money, it wasn't gold. It was something you could buy at any gas station. When money dies, commerce doesn't stop. People still need to eat, they still need medicine, they still need to trade, they just change the tool they use for exchange. Let's go to Germany. 1945. The war is over. The Third Reich has fallen. The Reichsmark is worthless litter blowing through bombed-out streets. Nobody wants it. Shops won't accept it. So what did people use? Cigarettes. Overnight, American cigarettes became the most powerful currency in Europe. U.S. soldiers could buy a carton of cigarettes at the base PX for $2. They'd walk outside and trade individual cigarettes for jewelry, cameras, watches, furniture. There are documented cases of entire houses being sold for a few cartons of Lucky Strikes. Why cigarettes? Think about the properties. They're small, portable, durable, and universally desired. Everyone knew what a cigarette was worth. They didn't spoil quickly. You could break them into smaller units for small purchases. They became the new money. The black markets in train stations and refugee camps didn't accept Reichsmarks. They operated entirely on tobacco. Allied military police reported that cigarettes functioned as currency with shocking efficiency. The market set exchange rates: 1 cigarette for a loaf of bread, 1 pack for a week's worth of vegetables, 1 carton for a bicycle. And here's the fascinating part. The laws of economics applied perfectly. When a new shipment of cigarettes arrived at a displaced person's camp, prices went up. More cigarettes in circulation meant each one bought less. That's inflation, using tobacco instead of paper. Fast forward to Venezuela, 2018. The bolivar didn't just lose value, it ceased to function as a medium of exchange. ATMs were empty. Credit cards didn't work. Banks limited withdrawals to amounts that couldn't buy a single meal, so the people went back to the Stone Age. They started bartering directly. Fishermen stopped selling fish for money. They traded their catch directly for bags of flour, just to feed their families. Suddenly, the most boring, mundane items in your house became the most valuable. Medical supplies and first aid kits, antibiotics and pain medication, canned food and dried goods, water filters and purification tablets, batteries, flashlights and lighters, soap, toothpaste and hygiene products, gasoline and diesel fuel. Here's one you probably never thought about: toilet paper. In a normal world, toilet paper is a convenience. In a collapse scenario, it's a medical necessity. If you run out of hygiene products, disease spreads rapidly. In a world without functioning hospitals, a simple infection can become a death sentence. Soap wasn't luxury, it was survival. But here's the trap, the fatal flaw of barter goods. They get consumed. You use them up. You can't build a 20-year retirement plan on batteries and canned beans. They're excellent for surviving weeks or months. They're terrible for preserving wealth across decades. They're tactical, not strategic. So you need one more category. You need an asset that produces value, that generates resources, but cannot be printed away by a government. This is the immobile store of value that produces the one thing human beings cannot negotiate on: food. Let's look at the Great Depression, 1930s America. In the cities, bankers in expensive suits stood in bread lines. Stockbrokers who'd been millionaires a year earlier were selling apples on street corners. They had paper wealth, fancy degrees, impressive titles, but they couldn't eat any of it. Out in the country, farmers were struggling too. They couldn't buy new clothes. They couldn't buy tractors or radios. Cash was scarce. But they had chickens laying eggs every morning. They had vegetable gardens. They had dairy cows producing milk. They had orchards bearing fruit. The banker had a zero balance in his bank account. The farmer had an omelet for breakfast, milk for his coffee, and an apple for dessert. Land produces calories. City real estate produces rent. When rent is paid in worthless money, the landlord starves. The farmer eats. During the Holodomor famine in Soviet Ukraine in the 1930s, cities were death traps. People in Kiev and Kharkiv starved by the millions. But even in the midst of government-created famine, farmers who could hide a small portion of their harvest survived. But before you run out and buy a farm, you need to understand the risks, and they are massive. Risk number 1. Land is immobile. You cannot put 50 acres in your suitcase and board a plane. If the country becomes politically unsafe, your wealth is trapped. Zimbabwe, year 2000. President Robert Mugabe's government decided to seize commercial farmland under the Fast Track Land Reform Program. They didn't buy the farms. They didn't offer compensation. They simply took them by decree. If you owned a productive farm, you lost it overnight. White farmers, many of whose families had worked the land for generations, were given days to evacuate. Total loss. The result? Zimbabwe went from being the breadbasket of southern Africa to a net food importer. Agricultural output collapsed by 60%. The land was redistributed to people without farming experience. Production plummeted. The economy cratered. Risk number 2. The taxman can always find you. You can hide gold in your garden. You can hide crypto on a USB drive. You cannot hide a 100-acre cornfield. When governments go broke, they hunt for revenue. And land is the easiest target because it's visible and immovable. Look at what's happening in Sri Lanka right now. The government is desperate for tax revenue. They're targeting landowners with aggressive property taxes. If you can't come up with the cash to pay, they'll seize the land. You might have plenty of food, but if you can't generate the currency to pay taxes, you lose the farm anyway. So when is farmland safe? Farmland is safest when 1. It's held in a politically stable country with strong property rights. 2. It produces export crops that generate hard currency: coffee, cacao, nuts. 3. It's held through corporate structures that are harder to seize. 4. You actually live on it or have trusted people managing it. 5. It's paid off completely, with no debt. If you own leveraged farmland in an unstable country, producing only domestic crops, held in your personal name, you're vulnerable. If you own debt-free agricultural land in New Zealand or Montana, producing export commodities, you're in a far better position. Now we need to talk about the victims. You need to know exactly what goes to zero, because if you're holding these assets during a currency collapse, you don't just lose a little, you lose everything. Death asset number 1, government bonds. A bond is an IOU. The government promises to pay you back in the future, with interest in their currency. But if that currency is hyperinflating, they're promising to pay you back in trash. In Weimar Germany, people who held government bonds were technically paid back in full. The government honored every promise, every coupon payment, every maturity date. But the money they received was worthless. A 1,000-mark bond that once bought a car was eventually worth less than a postage stamp. Argentina, 2001. The government defaulted on $82 billion in sovereign debt. Bondholders lost 70% overnight. It was the largest sovereign default in history at the time. Being a creditor to a broke government is financial suicide. Death asset Number 2, savings accounts and cash. This is the saddest one. This is where careful, prudent savers get slaughtered. If you keep your savings in a bank account denominated in a failing currency, you are mathematically guaranteed to lose. Lebanon, 2019 to 2023. If you had money in a Lebanese bank in 2019, you felt safe. The banks were clean, modern, sophisticated. Beirut was called the Paris of the Middle East. The currency had been stable for 22 years. Today, if you had 1 million Lebanese pounds in the bank, you technically still have 1 million pounds. The number on the screen didn't change, but that £1,000,000 used to buy a nice apartment. Now it buys 2 tanks of gas. The bank didn't steal your money. The government stole your purchasing power through inflation. History is crystal clear. Cash in a dying system goes to zero. This isn't just history. This is happening right now. The pattern is repeating in real time, and if you know what to look for, the warning signs are unmistakable. Warning sign 1. Iraq, Stage 3. Right now, Iraq is experiencing a severe liquidity crisis. Banks are restricting withdrawals. The Iraqi dinar is collapsing on the black market, trading at rates 20% weaker than the official rate. People are smuggling US dollars across the border into Turkey and Jordan. Iraqis are panic buying gold. This is Stage 3. The currency starts to slip, and informed people are quietly exiting. Warning sign number 2. Turkey. Stage 4. Turkish citizens are in full panic mode. In the last year, gold deposits in Turkish banks have doubled. The Turkish lira has lost 80% of its value since 2018. People are dumping the lira as fast as they earn it. They're buying dollars, euros, and gold. This is Stage 4, the flight to safety. The stampede has started. Warning. Sign number 3, Lebanon, Stage 5. The collapse is complete, 98% loss. The banks are zombie institutions. They've frozen accounts, they've imposed capital controls, the currency is dead. This is Stage 5, total failure. Lebanon is a live autopsy. But there's one more thing we need to discuss, the elephant in the room that everyone's thinking about but nobody wants to say out loud, the United States of America. As of this recording, the U.S. national debt is over $35 trillion. That number is so large it doesn't feel real. It sounds made up. So let me put it in terms that make sense. Right now, the U.S. government spends more money paying interest on the national debt than it spends on the entire defense budget. Think about that. We spend more servicing past borrowing than we spend protecting the country. Interest payments don't build aircraft carriers. They don't fund the military. They don't protect anything. They're just the cost of past mistakes. And the bill is accelerating. In 1980, U.S. debt was $900 billion. By 2000, it was $5.6 trillion. By 2008, it was $10 trillion. By 2020, it was $27 trillion. Today, it's over $35 trillion. Here's the math that should terrify you. At current spending rates, the Congressional Budget Office projects the U.S. will add another $20 trillion in debt over the next decade. That's $2 trillion per year. There is no plan to pay it back. There is no political will to cut spending. Both parties are addicted to deficit spending. Now, here's the part that changes everything. In 1970, the U.S. dollar represented 80% of global foreign currency reserves. It was the undisputed king. Everyone wanted dollars. Everyone needed dollars. Today, that number has dropped to 58%, and it's falling faster each year. This isn't new. This is history on repeat. In 1913, the British pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. It dominated global trade. The sun never set on the British Empire. Everyone trusted it. Everyone used it. 40 years later, Britain was broke. The pound crashed, and the US dollar took its crown. Now the dollar is following the exact same trajectory. Here's the brutal truth that nobody in Washington wants to admit. Currency collapse isn't a rare disaster. It's the historical norm. Since 1700, there have been over 20 cases of hyperinflation globally. France did it twice. Russia did it twice. China did it 3 times. According to research by the Cologne Institute for Economic Research, the average lifespan of a fiat currency, paper money with no backing, is roughly 27 years. The current US dollar system has been running for 54 years, double the average lifespan. Here's an even darker statistic. 99% of all currencies that have ever existed in human history no longer exist. They failed. They went to zero. They were replaced. The US dollar is not special. It's not immune. The math doesn't care about history or military power or global influence. The question isn't if the dollar will eventually fail. History and mathematics say it will. The only question is, will you be ready when it does? You don't need to be a doomsday prepper. You don't need to build a bunker or hoard ammunition or quit your job and move to the woods. That's panic, and panic is the enemy of survival. I want you to prepare. There's a difference. Real preparation means understanding that different assets behave differently during chaos. Most people think they're diversified because they own stocks in 3 different American companies. That's not diversification. If the dollar collapses, all 3 of those companies are in trouble. That's like being on the Titanic and switching from the dining room to the lounge. You're still on the sinking ship. True diversification means owning assets that don't depend on one government, one currency, or one system. Gold doesn't need the Federal Reserve to exist. A farm doesn't need a functioning bank to grow corn. Foreign currency doesn't care about U.S. debt. Export-focused companies don't rely on American consumers. These are lifeboats. The warning lights are flashing. You saw them in Turkey. You saw them in Lebanon. And if you're paying attention, you're starting to see them here. The autopsy is clear. The patient is terminal. But knowing what to buy is only half the equation. You also need to know when the final crack will happen. There's a specific trigger event that occurred right before every major financial collapse in the last 100 years. It happened in 1929, right before the Great Depression. It happened in 2008, right before the global financial crisis. And according to the charts, it's setting up to happen again within the next 6 months. I broke down exactly what this signal looks like with charts, data, and historical evidence in the video linked right here. It's the single most important pattern in modern finance, and the mainstream media is completely ignoring it. If you want to see the trigger before it gets pulled, click here. I'll see you there.